I want you to notice that these are not that far apart from each other. And they're not really that far apart from classical liberalism. It's just slight difference here, about the same there, slight differences, just here and there. This is not that far from each other. Just dialed up a little bit more here on the social contract, about where it is for right to revolt. The, of course, the clear individual rights all the way up, maxed. Classical liberalism, modern conservatism, and modern liberalism is all maxed on the individual rights. It's not that far from each other. So that's one thing that I really want you to take away from this, is how similar, or how this is kind of like two sides of the same coin. Hi, and welcome to the Johnny Random Show. Today, I'm going to do a presentation, and I'm going to be discussing where modern conservatism and liberalism sort of came from, and trace it to our modern today, and give us some common language to talk about. So I've made this whiteboard of notes, so to speak, so you can follow along with my logic here. So, and we will have some questions at the end. So guys, if you will hold questions that just can't be held until the end, for those that are joining me on the Zoom call. So the obviously democracy has been around for a long time. Republics have been around a long time. You have the Roman Republic, of course, the Greece democracy. Various forms have existed throughout history. You have philosophers on law and all sorts of things that we derive a lot of our current political thoughts from. Moses, Hammurabi, Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, to name a few. Then what really happens in about the Renaissance is when we get to sort of the modern thoughts for America. So that's where I'm going to start with a lot of this. So it's important to note a few characters in here. Of course, around that time, you had the printing press, which was a pretty big deal. You had a lot of religious reforms. Martin Luther. I wrote the time here so that you can note the time frame that we're talking about. This is 1400 to 1546. That is before America, several 200 years before America. I think that's important to note. And then we'll come back to Adam Smith in a second here. But in this Renaissance age, you had some thinkers, some very important thinkers. You had Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. Now, we're not going to spend a ton of time on these other thinkers, and I really encourage anybody that's interested in tracing back political ideologies to look up all of the people that I'm mentioning in this video. But I'm going to focus on John Locke, because John Locke gave us three very important principles, which the only thing I didn't write down. But basically, he gave us something called the social contract and the right to revolt, and he discussed individual rights. These are three concepts that he refined. He didn't come up with them, obviously. You have a lot of centuries of history, but he was able to articulate it in a very, very, very succinct way in the age that he was in. And he's a very important person because he wrote some of the things that we look back on, our founding fathers looked back on and pulled from John Locke. So he is considered in a lot of ways one of the first thinkers when it comes to classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is an ideology that at the time was at odds with the authoritarian monarchs or monarchy at the time. So we'll just go over here real quick, because I'm going to give you basically, don't look at any of this yet here, a calibration. So the way I think about ideologies, so basically if you take, go to any college and you look at how that they, classify ideologies, a lot of times you'll have the political compass, which has like an authoritarian axis and a government involvement, like an economic axis, like how much do you put onto social issues and how much do you put on the government's responsibility to take care of its people. So I don't like to think about that. I think that is a horrible way to look at politics. I like to think of it more on settings in a car. When you get a car, you have the bass, the treble, and the middle, and all these different sort of settings. that's how I think about it. America, classical liberalism is essentially this setting. The setting will be the social contract, which is how much you sort of invest in the idea that society as a whole should be taking care of those less fortunate for us, for other people. The R was the right to revolt. It's the idea that John Locke basically articulated as, if it's not a legitimate government, if government is acting illegitimately, and the people should have a right to fight against it. And that is something that he articulated here. Individual rights, these are inalienable rights that came from, not from government, not from any institution, but they are direct rights. They're inalienable rights given to you by God. Then you have here the M stands for monarch, and then LG would be limited government, or legitimate government, is how I think you should think about it as well. So obviously Americans, all about freedom, right? So you have this individual rights would be the highest setting, social contract, right to revolt, and then monarchy is zero, nada, nothing. We don't think that that's a legitimate role, or plays a legitimate role in our society. This is basically the factory setting for America. This is, I think, largely what John Locke articulated. Maybe there's some variances here, or maybe he had all three of these up, monarch at zero, whatever, and limited government about halfway. But anyway, so let's move on. We're talking American politics, right? So let's get to America. John Locke was an Englishman, and he lived from 1774 to 1788. So he barely saw the American Revolution. He was supportive of it from across the pond, and but it was a little bit after his time, or at the end of his time. But he was certainly a part of those conversations. And obviously Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams were all very familiar with the works of John Locke. So let's get into the right and left, right? So Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke, which that's supposed to say Burke, not Jefferson, sorry. Should really be Burke. My handwriting is atrocious, especially on the fly like this, but you get it. Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke. Now, Thomas Paine was an American. He was very radical. He felt like we had the tools and resources coming out of the Renaissance, and that we knew how to govern. And if we were to take these principles, he looked around the world and he said, we have the formula, we need to apply the formula. And when he looks around and things aren't going the way that it should go, he questions, why that isn't. He's never satisfied, Thomas Paine. Edmund Burke, on the other hand, was an Englishman, and he supported the revolution in America, but he didn't support the revolution in the French Revolution. And the reason why is he thought that you shouldn't just throw away the history and completely replace it from scratch, that wouldn't work. That Thomas Paine basically thought that every man was a blank slate, so to speak, and had the ability, or should have the ability, to self-govern. Edmund Burke was more of the mind where you can build on. No man was born into no society. Everyone is born into a society, whether it's a family, a country, a tribe. Everyone is born into some sort of circumstances. And so this idea that Paine had constructed is sort of an incorrect way to look at the world. So they had some interesting letters going back and forth. And again, I encourage you to look into these two people. There's some fascinating things to find about them. Then let's see. So that is where we get the term left and right, and why people point back to Burke and Paine is because in the French Revolution, after the revolution, there were those who sort of supported the monarchy that sat on the right side, and the people that were totally against the new idea of democracy on the left side. Wait, I said that wrong. On the left side sat the ones that were for tearing down the monarchy, and on the right were more supportive. So you had the left and the right, and those are just shorthand terms that we used over the years. And when you get into the American Revolution, you sort of see this right-left divide, and it's a natural divide that happens when you start with classical liberalism with these settings. How much are you going to put into the society versus individual rights, limited government? What is your settings? So we can go down here to fast forward to modern conservatism. Modern conservatism, generally speaking, still keeps it about halfway for the social contract. The right to revolt is all the way up, gun rights, all of these things, Second Amendment. There's a very heavy emphasis in the modern conservative movement that we need that right, and should be one of the central focuses of this ideology, conservative ideology. Then, of course, individual rights, obviously maxed out. So those two are maxed out, bring down the social contract a little bit. Obviously, the monarchy is at 0, and limited government or legitimate government should only be here at small, and in a very limited capacity. So you have that here. So limited on social contract, limited government, large on individual rights and the right to revolt. That's sort of how a conservative would set their dials, so to speak. Then you have a modern liberal, where you have the social contract is very high. Put a lot of stock in taking care of those around us. In a liberal democracy, we should have safeguards and safety nets and all these things. So they have a very high, calibrated very high. Now, on the right to revolt, it's actually not at 0, which might surprise some conservatives. There is, in American liberal ideology, the idea that the government should not overstep. The government should not do things that they don't think that we should do. We shouldn't be fighting foreign wars. We shouldn't do all these things. You can clearly see this in liberal ideology. And we got a little, obviously the monarchy 0, and then all the way up on this limited government or legitimate government. That's why I said legitimate government, because I think that the liberals think about government as, and this goes back to Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, primarily, was the idea that democracy, true democracy, we would elect those that can govern and that have a high degree of competence, and that would therefore we would have legitimate institutions. So we can put a lot of, we can keep this dial cranked high because we're operating under assumption that true democracy will bring about this outcome. And we're not worried about the monarch. We don't think that's legitimate. We don't think that there should be an authoritarian dictator over us. But if we have true democracy, then the government should be legitimate always. So I want you to notice that these are not that far apart from each other. And they're not really that far apart from classical liberalism. It's just slight difference here, about the same there, slight differences, just here and there. This is not that far from each other. Just dialed up a little bit more here on the social contract, about where it is for right to revolt. The, of course, the clear individual rights all the way up, maxed, classical liberalism, modern conservatism, and modern liberalism is all maxed on the individual rights. It's not that far from each other. So that's one thing that I really want you to take away from this, is how similar, or how this is kind of like two sides of the same coin in America. And I want to take just quickly get into libertarianism and socialism. Whereas these are the two sides of the same coin, I think that these are very similarly two sides of the same coin. This goes back to John Adams over here. I was going to talk about him before I get into this because it relates. Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. It's very popular. The first couple chapters, he's describing the division of labor, and he talks about how that is an efficient way that humans naturally build themselves out. And so we get a lot of the concepts of free market from that. I actually read Wealth of Nations, got the audio book. It's fascinating. It's really long, but it's worth it. But one thing that caught my attention that I think is worth noting is that it doesn't, Adam Smith very much kind of turns away from the idea when it gets into trade. He thinks that naturally people will want to trade within their own borders. He thinks that that would be a natural thing to do. And if people start trading across borders, then that would cause problems with the division of labor. And because you're so detached from your work already, when with the special division of labor, where you're making 900 pins a day or 900 horseshoes or whatever you're making in a day, and you don't see the output of what that is and how that impacts and changes lives and helps people, your work. Whereas a blacksmith, in the older days would get his horseshoe, put it on the horse, shake hands with the person he's doing business with. It's a fulfilling type of labor. And so Adam Smith was very worried about that and very brought that up and was very much ahead of his time. And I think you see strands of that in libertarianism and socialism. So let's get to that. So libertarianism puts no stock at all in this social contract. Let's put that down. We don't see that there's a lot of benefit to having a social contract because everyone should be taking care of their own rights, individual rights all the way up. We're going to turn that down. We're going to turn that up so that there's a focus on this, and this is almost ignored. Okay, the right to revolt. Most libertarians are very anti-authoritarian, that they see it as illegitimate. There's no such thing as legitimate government. This is a libertarian setting. This is illegitimate. This is illegitimate. This should be taken care of. If you're focused on this, if you're focused on the individual, then you'll take care of the needs of yourself and those around you, in theory. There's not a lot of people that are truly libertarian. It's not as common, and you can see, in America, and from our founding and the ideology that where we came from, it's just not as popular in America. So then you have socialism. Socialism is social contract all the way up. Monarch, legitimate government. This is an authoritarian person that says that I can give you, trade away these. There's inalienable rights that no one can take away from you, but there's alienable rights. These are rights that, like to freedom, protection, these things that you can sort of trade and barter with a little bit. So they're going to give up the individual rights for the social contract. This is a setting that is common to feudalism, the concept of feudalism in ancient times, the caste system, lots of things throughout history. There's this, this is not a foreign setting. A matter of fact, this is, if you're a nomad, this is your life. No strings on me, gypsy, whatever. If you want to be in a society where you're taken care of by a lord, there's a lot of room for abuses, which is where this came from, which is where a lot of this came from, where a lot of this came from. A lot of these ancient thinkers were addressing issues with this and not so much this, because it's just sort of the default anti. These are two sides of an opposite coin. So let me go back a little bit through American history, because I think it's important to track this. I wanted to give you a frame of reference, but I also want to track it. I gave you Payne and Burke. Burke is not even American. So let's give you Hamilton and Adams. In America, when we were trying to decide how we're going to run our brand new democratic republic, we have representatives, and there was I'm sure you're probably familiar with the Federalist Papers that Hamilton wrote, and he was very much for building these new institutions. We had a democracy to govern. John Adams, which was Washington's vice president and successor, the Federalists, this was the Federalist Party. They were on this, from the root core concept, you think you can, well, they were all very united, but the concept that, and Burke and Payne were not that divided. It was just a little bit, how do you do this? But they both had this individual rights. They both had the right to revolt. They both had some version of a social contract. And so how do we put that into a legitimate government? Where Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison were very much limited government everything, limited institutions. We shouldn't have these things. And the Federalists won out. The Federalists it was much more popular of an idea. Okay, we've thrown off the monarchy. Now we're going to build something new in its place. The reason why George Washington left and said that he called them factions, not political parties, he called them factions, but he's very much against them. He saw them as divisive, and many of the founding fathers did as well. They all were against political parties. However, they ended up founding them. You had Thomas Jefferson, James Madison as the Democratic Republicans, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams. These were the Federalists. There were different ways of thinking about how to do America. We all kind of come with this default, but how are we going to run it? Are we going to do it this way? We're going to put an emphasis here. We're going to put an emphasis here. So that was the debates of the time. And then you had a transition. You had the Great Awakening in America. You had people that were against slavery, abolitionists, and all these new set of issues. When the United States threw off the monarch, right, we had a period where the issues were, how do we run this, right? And now that we're running something, we're running it. And actually the Democratic Republicans came to power when the Federalists overstepped their bounds by doing the Alien and Sedition Act. Then the Democratic Republicans came to power, and they to the idea to tear these institutions down. They were undemocratic in their mind, and they didn't actually do that, but that's what they had ran on. Their party platform was to run on that, but they just sort of went along with it because it made sense at the time to have something to go off of, and it was actually fairly popular. The Federalists had just overstepped their bounds and were basically gone. Now, then you have the age with where slavery became a big deal. And, you had your Free Soil Party, which is sort of the precursor to the Republican Party. And you had this, the Whigs Party, which were sort of kind of back to the Burkean ideology. And then what became eventually, not Thomas Jefferson, Lincoln was a Whig, young Whig senator, and then he became one of the Republicans, which was the Free Soil Party, the abolition of slavery, and came to power. So because you had a different set of issues, we were pushing out west, and were we going to let these states be free states or slave states? And so you had a great debate at the time, and I think, of course, we all know how that turned out. Then there's been more debates where the left ideology, where we have the tools to govern, we are untrusting, and yet we think that if we democratically elect people, that these people will be able to be the professional class and be able to rule for us. That is a common theme that you see on the left to progressives today. Why do we call them socialist a lot of times? Is because we're on the right, they would say that that you're taking this, this is actually this. We're calling it this because we're looking and we're focusing on how they're, not what they're saying, but what in effect we think that'll be. Whereas liberals often criticize conservatives for just being this, anti-everything, anti-social contract, don't want to take care of the poor, racist, all these different things. So there's a disconnect. These people tend to call these people this thing, and these people tend to call these people this thing. So that is happening over the course of history. Of course, after that, you had the Great Depression and another shift in how people saw things. You had the rise of the progressives. And then, of course, with Ronald Reagan and the rise of the conservatives, it's kind of how we got here. So there are people that are here, but I would submit that a lot of people that call themselves conservatives have set their settings more closer to libertarians. Not exactly this. They haven't gone full to this, but they dial this down, and they dial this down. And that's the way they talk. And then you have a lot of liberals that, dial this down to zero. They're the right to revolt, but, we're actually going to effectively make that meaningless. And so I think you can see how our modern debate in politics is largely a debate about these settings. And the point of this video is to give you where these came from, the historical path. There's so much to look into. There's so much to know. And I encourage you to go look at other sources, look up these individuals, but put it through the framework of this, how we got here, where these individuals fell on the map, ideologically speaking, to get us where we are. I think that will help us all understand where we are and about what's next. I mentioned that you had the expansion west, and now you have an expansion to the world, right? We're in a globalized system. The world is smaller than it's ever been. We have corporations that have businesses on every continent, and we have the internet that brings our neighbor into our own house, brings people across the world into our house. The world has gotten smaller. That's our new frontier. And that is what the debates of today are going to be about. And if you look at it through this lens, what is our role to each other and how do we talk about each other? I think you can derive a lot of these issues from this right here. And that is my presentation, and we will open it up to questions. And what do you guys have for me? Was that even coherent at all?
Well, I thought it was pretty good. When you talk about the social contract, I thought of it in another way, and that was area of responsibility. Whose responsibility is certain things? So I look at it sort of the same, the same dial in a sense.
Yeah.
How much responsibility does the individual have? How much responsibility does the government have as far as the social contract? So I don't know if that would help any in understanding, what the social contract is there. Social contract is a good word. I know we have discussed that word. I don't know that everybody else would immediately go to, oh, that's what that is. And when it comes to individual rights, and you talk about, it being a certain thing for liberals and conservatives, and it seems to be a pick and choose. We want individual rights when it comes to abortion, for a liberal, but not free speech. You know what I'm saying? It's like, my body, blah, blah, but when conservatives say, I don't want to wear a mask, my body, my, same thing, I mean, well, which is it? Is it my body, like when you got a baby and when you're wearing a mask, or, and of course, I know that, for me personally, it's not just the individual right. I don't see the individual right there for someone to take another human being's life. So, but we sometimes skew those things, individual rights, depending on what our issue is, what we consider important, and we say this is, individual rights, and maybe aren't consistent all the way across.
Yeah, I think that's what I tried to pull out, is that these guys agreed on so much, yet their focus was from a different place. And that focus is what made them focus on where the dial should exactly be oriented on any given issue. So the fact of the matter is, we're not so different as we think we are in a lot of ways, liberal and conservatism. It's how much most people are about here. They think that, obviously to some degree, I think it's ingrained in us. I think it's ingrained in our culture. And so therefore you come like this, you know, as an American. As you get more involved in politics, you see more merit to, you know, this, you might dial this down or this up or this back or, you know, whatever. I think that that is what we essentially do in schools and in colleges and on YouTube videos. We're trying to give you the correct settings, dials for how to look at it. You should look at mask this way because it's individual rights. You know, you should look at abortion this way because it's individual rights. But we both agree that that this exists, that this is something that should take place. Whereas if truly socialism do not believe in the right of the individual, they do not believe that. There is this collective good. There's a collective, I'm giving up that right. I don't believe that I have a right. I don't think I have a responsibility as an individual. I think I have a responsibility as a society, but I don't have a responsibility as an individual. And I think that that is maybe the most helpful thing that I think about how to conceptualize this in this way.
Well, there's also, their rights imply responsibility, but they're not 100% attached. It is possible for a culture to have responsibilities of the individual without rights to the individual. So there are somewhat socialist tribal cultures where each individual member has a responsibility to the society, but they don't have actually any rights per se from the society. Everything is shared collectively. So there are individual responsibilities and collective rights, if that makes sense. But at any rate, yeah, there's never 100% consistency. You can't have it. So this is me just switching gears. I'm not sure if that was clear, but you never have 100% consistency when it comes to anybody's thoughts. And that is itself a value. You can value consistency or you can not value consistency. And in the past, classical liberalism, which is not something we've really talked about, but classical liberalism would cover both what you've called America, conservative and liberal, the historical views. Classical liberalism has valued consistency as much as possible. It doesn't necessarily matter how I feel. It matters what is true. Let's all work together to try to get to what is true. And that is something that is a value. It's not inherent to all systems. Many people around the world will base what they think based on nothing more than what they intuit. You know, they don't have necessarily a reason for why they believe one thing or another. They believe it. It feels right. They're going to do it. And many people today, especially, there's been a huge shift since the 60s, I would say, maybe even before that, towards, definitely before that, because you also have a lot of that in the 1800s, towards if I feel that it's correct, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow my intuition, and I don't necessarily have to justify it. What that does, though, is it breaks down the ability to communicate across, conservative and whatnot, conservative and liberal. And I think that's really reflective of why conservatives tend to look at liberals and see socialists, and liberals tend to look at conservatives and see libertarians, is because there's been that breakdown of the value of objective truth. And that, I think, is really reflecting. That is why we've got to this situation. You've described the situation well, but why we've gotten there is due to a lack of the value of truth, of absolute truth. Because if I value absolute truth, I'm not going to look at a liberal as a conservative. I'm not going to look at a liberal and mischaracterize what they've said and say, oh yeah, you are a socialist. You know, I'm going to actually give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to look into and try to reason with these people. But if either side decides that the other side is just the enemy and they're trying to destroy America, then, and you're not trying to work towards truth together, then you're going to end up fracturing the country. You're going to end up with anarchy instead of socialism, libertarianism, conservatism, or liberalism. You're just going to end up with anarchy.
So I think that what you're describing is, and I agree. I think this is classical liberalism. This is basically what John Locke and the founding fathers settled on. So this is one ideology, classical liberalism. This is another, and this is socialism. And this are both derived from this. Like this is we're trying to get our settings around what this should be. We think all Americans should be orienting your settings more towards this or more towards this, not this. This is not what Americans naturally came from. This is not what Americans came from. You know, this is basically what Americans came from, this classical liberal strain of thought. And so when the libertarians have basically infiltrated, it's a bad word, have expanded the ideology and had thinkers in the last several years that have made compelling cases on why the right side of the argument should be closer to this instead of this. And I think that rather than going this direction, I think that we should be going back towards this direction. Honestly, that's my thing. I think we should go back closer to what our founding is and away from libertarianism. I think that even John Smith in The Wealth of Nations makes a strong case for that. Liberals tend to be moving this direction. But I think it's largely because we think of the world as authoritarian versus anarch. We have authoritarian versus anarchy line, and then we have a like social responsibility. And if you're over here or over here, or over here, you're somewhere in the center of this like classical libertarian thought. But if you're on this side of the line, then you're like libertarian, don't care about anybody, anything like that. If you're on this side, you're authoritarian, you're a socialist, because we think in these left and right, up and down, black and white terms. It's not helpful. That is really my case. This political compass that you often see on the internet is not helpful, constructive way to think about our American political ideology. It might be fine for describing this, but it misses this. There's only 3 ideologies. And within one of those ideologies, you have 2. So there's 4, but these are subcategories of this classical libertarianism. So there's classical liberalism, and then there's libertarianism and socialism. I think that's only three ideologies. And then within classical liberalism is the modern conservative and the modern liberal. And they get mischaracterized with these other things that are very easy to see. You're either for the state or against the state. You're either, for taking care of the poor or against taking care of the poor. It's this black and white world that we've all sort of come from, but we have this foundation, this beautiful, rich history that's been given to us, and a foundation, a way to think about this that's beautiful. And I think that the conservative side is probably, where I find myself more in that Burkean school of thought. We're all the same. We're both the same, but I find myself more in that, we shouldn't have this revolutionary. I get up and I look around and I'm just surprised that anything works at all. That's something that Burke said. I look around and I'm surprised that any of this works. And therefore, to tear it all down and start over is not a constructive way to do this, to carry out what you're trying to do. And I think that idea won originally in our founding with the Federalist, but then it went too far. It started trending back towards this back towards the monarchy, back towards you can't criticize the president. That was the Alien and Sedition Act, basically the essence of it. You went too far this way, and the conservatives are always being blamed of being this, but also this. It's a confusing argument that liberals have on, conservatives. One time they're criticizing us for being libertarian, and then other minutes they're criticizing us for being authoritarian and going in and spreading democracy around the world, and we don't have any business doing on it. And then they sound more conservative, more classical liberal, more like the founding fathers than we do, conservatives do. But that's because we have this history, this heritage that we're basically coming from this. And then you get socialized into one of these two as you grow up. Or you continue on, past the conservatism down into this, or you continue on past liberalism back into these. And I think that we need to dial it up. We need to go back to our founding. And I think that there's value in each of these thoughts at different times, different aspects of the argument, that there's value in listening to our liberal friends, and there's value in listening to a lot of things that conservatives get right, and doing politics better.
Yeah. I look at the two bottom ones, the libertarian and socialist, and it's interesting to me that socialists, at least in Russia, China, were atheists, and libertarianism, if you think of Ayn Rand, yeah, she left Russia, and it seems to be like a reaction, but still an atheist. So you have atheism kind of at the heart of both of the libertarian and socialist viewpoints, opposite ends of atheism. Then you have liberal and conservatives. I consider both of them coming out of a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, Judeo-Christian worldview, because liberals care about the poor, and so do we. We just have a different way of handling that. They're concerned about the poor, so let's give and provide and do these things. And we say, okay, but that doesn't work long term. It ends up being
an enabler.
Not understanding what it is it's not understanding the nature of man. It's thinking that man is basically good. And so, if we do all these things for people, it'll all work out because man is basically good and all. And conservatives, certainly not all, but some would say, there's both. Man is created in the image of God. He also has a fallen nature. And so we have to have these checks and balances in there, and we have to be people that aren't just giving away everything and being taken advantage of. There seems to be a naivety. That word. Liberals tend to be naive, I think, because they don't take into account. It's kind of a Christianity that doesn't have the sin nature in it. And so they're all the time trying to do things good for people, and think that if you have these, as you mentioned, these elites who govern and have been educated and all this kind of thing, they will take care of us and our society and do everything right. We look at it and say, no, there is problematic as any government or as any individual is. And so conservatives say we've got to have these other things in there that don't seem very kind at times, that say, we'll help you out for a while, and we know that there's a need, but it comes to an end. You've got to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, and that responsibility thing. And so I see this as being very helpful, your layout, because I didn't think of it that way. But I think you're right. I don't think the bottom two fit with America as it is in its historically. Yeah. And I think that they will fail or will kill each other.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think one other thing that I want to say that I didn't really tie this through because I didn't really know how to do it exactly, but of course, Martin Luther and the Reformation was a big impact on Adam Smith, James Locke, John Locke, sorry, into these people. It is a big influence in their lives. And John Locke wrote a whole a book about like rationalizing Christianity. And so you have of course, Thomas Paine, wrote Common Sense, which is, very, atheistic, but either way, but the influence of Christianity was obviously there, and the influence of this Judeo-Christian values is obviously in our founding. I don't think it's possible to take that out. And when you look at what the Great Awakenings that happened in America were precursors to these large tectonic shifts in our parties and how what moved next. You really can't understand fully the abolition of slavery movement without understanding the Great Awakening. If you try to teach that in schools, just all of a sudden people just realized after thousands of years that suddenly slavery was bad. And we knew that because these, founding fathers, like it's muddy. It doesn't make sense. But when you understand it in the context of these preachers that were preaching that it was sin and that we had to abolish slavery, and it motivated people to actually take action and get involved, then you understand why we fought a civil war about it. So, and the Second Great Awakening, like I said, originally the Martin Luther, the Reformation, these were very, very important events that moved the ball towards where we are today. And I don't think that we're going to get to the next iteration of our politics, because we're stuck in this sort of progressive era, this post what's it called? Great Depression era, where we fight about, this really, it's social contract, what goes in the social contract, and the right to revolt, gun rights. I mean, that's not really where the argument so much is, but, if we're going to talk about it coherently and make good arguments for it, then I think we need to understand our history as conservatives, and the liberals need to understand their history as classical liberals, and it will help give us a place to start common language in order to address the issues of globalization. We're moving into another age. Like I said, the world got smaller, and as we expanded, west, we had the whole issue with slavery. We had the Great Awakening, and that caused this thing to come to a resolution and move us into the next era of politics, where you had the left and the right debating big issues of the day, important issues of the day. Our left and the right are not talking about the important issues of the day because there's no frame of reference. There's no context. Like, how do we talk about trade? How do we talk about, should we be sending our jobs overseas or not? Should we be doing healthcare or not, like healthcare for all or not? Because we need to debate it within the context of American values, what our founding principles are. If we can look at our founding principles and we can debate the nuances, we can come up with a really good system for how we conduct our trade, how we do immigration, how we our tech platforms, how those are supposed to be operated. We can come to consensus if we understand how to talk about it. This is not helpful for how we talk about it. This debate does not get us to where we need to be. This, racism versus, socialist, does not get us to talking about immigration, does not getting us talk about globalized trade, does not getting us talking about tech and how that impacts our lives and free speech. We've got to roll it back to this. And that is really the crux of all of this. So yeah, you guys have any other thing? Sorry, I took back over. It's supposed to be question and answer.
I think that to say concisely what really made America unique and what can make this work again would be that we have to have civil disagreements, as in we need to be civilized in our disagreements.
Yeah.
You have to remember that while the truth matters, and that's something that is up for debate right now as far as in our culture,
Mhm.
but the truth should matter, and that we should be striving to figure out what is actually true to reality.
Yeah.
So while the truth matters, neighbor matters too. And that's what the idea of giving the benefit of the doubt is about. And that's what not vilifying your opponent is about. And
It's
those
almost
are
like you're
things,
talking about toleration. John Locke wrote a book about toleration. John
right?
Locke is
Exactly.
a great person to look back and say, you're not perfect.
And
None
freedom of
of them are perfect.
speech, freedom of speech by definition is an act of loving your neighbor, allowing them to express themselves instead of shouting them down or heckling them or things like that. So those are values that are very much tied to America. And those two values in balance, both valuing truth and valuing your neighbor's ability to express and to not be vilified, and being civil in your disagreements. Those are things that have made America great. We've, to various degree had success with that. There's no perfect society in the entirety of history. America is not the perfect society, but we've had a lot of success because we have followed these principles, which again are tied to the Christian values and Christian outlook on life. Whether or not you are a Christian, if you have been influenced by Christian values, you tend to hold those two things as good and obvious. Many cultures around the world, if you said, "Oh yeah, you should have the right to revolt if things are not going your way," they're like, "What? No, that doesn't make any sense." It's not a part of their culture, and they obey the tribal leader. They obey the king. It's not built in that people have inalienable rights. It's not obvious to these people, because that's not a part of their experience. It's a value that we have that comes from Christianity, from the Judeo-Christian worldview. So that's what I would emphasize more than anything.
I think
If
that's
you want,
why.
if you like the best
Mhm.
parts of America, you've got to continue to, at the very minimum, support that. Um, Honestly, you really need to be knowledgeable of Christ.
Yeah. I think this has been tried in history. This has been tried in history. These both work. This has
Ish.
been tried multiple times. Greece, Roman Republic, all these different places, it's been tried and it has, varying degrees of success and failure. And my fear is that it is, like you said, it has to have a foundation. It has to have, a Judeo-Christian foundation to really work well. And it has to have an educated population. It has to have a tolerant population at minimum for it to work. Or we're going to find ourselves in the list of the Greece democracies, Roman republics, American experiment. It's not guaranteed to last, is what I'm saying. And that is truly what I'm fighting for here. So we are going to do another episode on after the summer. This channel is going to take a little pause. In a few weeks, we're doing a couple more episodes, the longer normal podcasts that we do. I've got a couple interviews coming up with some politicians as well, which is going to be fantastic on this channel. But we're going to do one where we're going to talk about libertarianism and debate it a little bit with Paul, who's on this channel frequently, and he's a big, he considers himself a libertarian. So I want to debate these two things. And this is where I find myself in between these two, a little bit, trying to go back to sort of the founding, try to understanding a little bit better, but I definitely see myself as a conservative. And I don't think of myself as a libertarian at all. So I want to debate with him about that. So that'll be an interesting episode that you should definitely catch. I can't debate liberalism versus socialism because I'm not, don't really find myself over here, and I don't feel like I'd be a great advocate for it. I'd just be playing devil's advocate. So Maybe I'll find somebody who's more on the libertarian, liberal spectrum, that'll debate some of those things maybe this way as well. So, but thank you for joining us on the Johnny Random Show, and we will see you next time. Have a great weekend.